April 14, 1966. Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam. Warrant Officer Kevin Dasher. Wheatley of the Australian SAS lay motionless in the undergrowth, his face painted green and black, watching a Viet Cong patrol pass less than 15 meters from his position. His heart hammered in his chest, but his breathing remained controlled, silent. Behind him, 4 more Australians waited like statues. The VC, 8 men carrying AK-47s and rice sacks, moved carelessly down the trail, talking in low voices, completely unaware they were being watched. Wheatley's hand hovered near his rifle, but he didn't move. He didn't fire. He just watched. 300 meters to the west, an American platoon from the 173rd Airborne was crashing through the jungle, searching for the same VC unit. Their boots snapped branches, their equipment rattled, and their radio crackled with constant chatter. They were following doctrine, aggressive patrolling, movement to contact, find the enemy and destroy him with overwhelming firepower. They'd been doing this for weeks, racking up decent body counts, but the VC kept coming back. The Americans were hunting the way they'd been taught at Fort Benning. The Australians were hunting the way they'd learned in Malaya, Borneo, and a dozen other jungle wars most Americans had never heard of. And that difference, that fundamental difference in how they approached the jungle, was about to change everything. When the first Australian advisors arrived in South Vietnam in 1962, they encountered an American military machine gearing up to fight the war. The American way, big operations, heavy firepower, and the absolute certainty that American military might, forged in the victories of World War II and tempered in Korea, would crush the Viet Cong within months. General William Westmoreland's search and destroy strategy was built on a simple premise: find the enemy, fix them in place, and annihilate them with artillery, airstrikes, and superior firepower. It looked good on paper. It had worked before. But the Australians took one look at it and thought, this is going to get a lot of people killed. The problem wasn't American courage or training. American soldiers were brave, well-equipped, and motivated. The problem was that they were fighting the wrong war in the wrong way. Captain Barry Peterson, an Australian officer who'd spent years fighting communist insurgents in Malaya, explained it to a group of American advisors in 1965. You're trying to catch fish by jumping into the river and grabbing them. We learned to put nets where the fish swim and wait. The Americans looked at him like he was crazy. Why wait when you could go out there and kill the enemy right now? But here's what the Australians understood that most Americans didn't. In the jungle, the side that moves loses, movement makes noise. Noise gets you killed. The VC weren't stupid. They'd been fighting in these jungles for 20 years, first against the Japanese, then the French. Now the Americans, they knew every trail, every hiding spot, every sound that didn't belong. When American patrols came crashing through the jungle, the VC heard them coming from a kilometer away, and either melted into the jungle or set up ambushes. Either way, the Americans were playing the VC's game. The Australian SAS operated on completely different principles they'd learned the hard way, fighting communist insurgents in the Malayan emergency. Between 1948 and 1960, British and Australian forces had fought communist guerrillas in the jungles of Malaya. Early on, they tried the aggressive approach, big sweeps, lots of firepower, and they got hammered. The communists were ghosts. They'd strike and disappear. But over 12 years, the Australians learned. They learned to track, to observe, to wait. They learned that in the jungle, patience wasn't weakness. It was the ultimate weapon. When the Australian SAS arrived in Vietnam in 1966, they brought these lessons with them, 5-man patrols would insert by helicopter into enemy territory and disappear. Not for hours or days, but for weeks. They moved so slowly that sometimes they'd cover less than a kilometer in an entire day. They'd stop every few minutes, watch, listen, observe. They didn't talk, they didn't smoke, they barely breathed, and they sure as hell didn't crash through the jungle announcing their presence to every VC within earshot. Sergeant Bob Kearney of the Australian SAS described the difference perfectly in a 1967 interview. The Americans wanted to find Charlie and kill him right now, today. We wanted to find Charlie, watch him, learn his patterns, figure out where he's going, and then kill his entire unit next week at a time and place where he thinks he's safe. It takes longer, but you get better results, and fewer of your mates die. The tactical differences were striking. American patrols moved in column formation, 30 to 40 men, weapons ready, expecting contact. Australian SAS patrols were 5 men, moving in single file so quietly you couldn't hear them from 10 meters away. Americans patrolled during the day and returned to base at night. Australians stayed out for 2 weeks, sleeping in the jungle, living off cold rations, becoming part of the environment. Americans called in airstrikes and artillery at the first sign of the enemy. Australians watched, tracked, and only called in strikes when they had confirmed targets and perfect intelligence. The results spoke for themselves. By late 1966, Australian SAS patrols were operating deep in VC-controlled territory with casualty rates below 3%. They were gathering intelligence that was saving American lives and calling in airstrikes that were destroying VC base camps and supply dumps that American patrols had walked past a dozen times without seeing. One Australian patrol spent 11 days tracking a VC logistics unit through Phuoc Tuy province, watching them, mapping their routes, identifying their supply caches. When they finally called in the strike, they destroyed 3 tons of rice, killed 6 VC, and captured weapons and documents. 0 Australian casualties. An American sweep of the same area 2 weeks earlier had found nothing. Some American units started to notice. Captain Jim Hughes of the 503rd Infantry worked with Australian advisors in early 1967, and it changed everything for him. They took us out on patrol, and I felt like I'd never been in the jungle before, Hughes recalled. We'd been stomping around making noise, and the Aussies moved like ghosts. They showed us tracks we'd walked right over, signs we'd completely missed. They could tell you how many VC had passed, what they were carrying, where they were going. It was like they could read the jungle like a book, and we'd been stumbling around blind. The Australian approach required something American doctrine didn't emphasize: patience. You had to be willing to spend days, sometimes weeks, gathering information without firing a shot. You had to resist the temptation to engage every VC you saw. You had to trust that waiting for the perfect moment would produce better results than immediate action. For American commanders, under pressure from Washington to produce body counts and show progress, this was almost impossible to accept. But the units that learned, the ones that embraced Australian tactics, became devastatingly effective. The 173rd Airborne, after training with Australian advisors, saw their casualty rates from ambush drop by 70%, while their kill ratios tripled. Macy VSOG reconnaissance teams trained by Australians were conducting deep penetration missions into Laos and Cambodia with survival rates that seemed impossible. Warrant Officer Kevin Wheatley, the Australian we met at the beginning lying in the jungle watching that VC patrol, didn't fire that day. He watched them pass, noted their direction, their equipment, their weapons. 2 days later, his intelligence led to an ambush that killed 17 VC with 0 friendly casualties. 3 weeks after that, Wheatley was killed in action, covering the evacuation of a wounded American advisor. He was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, Australia's highest military honor. The tactical lesson was clear. In jungle warfare, the hunter who moves forward is often the prey. The real predators moved backwards, got ahead of the enemy, and waited. But here's the tragedy. These tactics worked brilliantly at the tactical level. Australian-trained units became elite jungle fighters with remarkable success rates. But tactics don't win wars, strategy does. And the fundamental strategy in Vietnam, trying to defeat a revolutionary insurgency through attrition, was flawed from the start. The Australians could teach Americans to be better jungle fighters, to track like predators, to kill more efficiently with fewer casualties, and they did. The soldiers who learned became some of the finest jungle warriors in the world, but they couldn't teach American politicians and generals to answer the essential question: what political objective was worth the cost? By 1971, Australian forces were withdrawing from Vietnam. They'd lost 521 killed in action, far fewer per capita than American losses, largely because of their tactical approach. They'd proven that their methods worked. But like the Americans, they were leaving without victory. Superior tactics had met flawed strategy, and strategy won. The Australian SAS didn't refuse to fight like Americans because they thought they were better soldiers. They refused because they'd learned, through years of bitter experience in forgotten jungle wars, that in that kind of conflict, the American way got people killed for no strategic gain. They were right. The soldiers who learned that lesson survived. The war that ignored it was lost anyway.